The Expanse is a remarkable show. And I say this as someone who is watching it for the first time and is already halfway through season 2. Which is a great place for me to state that I am still watching the show, so please don't drop any spoilers beyond season 2, episode 5, also called Home, which is the episode where Miller makes his way back to Heros and runs into proto-molecule Julie, and we come full circle in a moment that I found particularly beautiful. Disturbing, no doubt about it, but beautiful nonetheless. And yes, there will be a future video where I try and untangle the absolute mess and bonkers nature of the weird-ass relationship that Miller has with Juliet Andromeda Mao, but like I said, it's a video for the future. Right now, I would like to talk about James Holden and Josephus Miller and how similar they actually are. Which is mind-boggling, I know, because one is the most morally good, sanctimonious paladin character you can find within a world like The Expanse, complete with the stick up his ass and the moral self-righteousness that comes with that. And the other is a gung-ho, shoot first, ask questions later, morally ambiguous former cop who grew up on Eros and followed his friend Sematimba's suggestion of being the boot instead of the ass, and thus spent a lot of the opening salvo of the first season with his boot on the asses of his fellow belters on series, with the occasional moment when his humanity peeks through until events with Julie sent him careening in the journey that culminates to what happens in season 2, episode 5. These two characters, whilst vastly different, especially in their approaches and what sets them off on the journey that would see their paths cross in the 8th episode of the first season after Miller saves Holden and the rest of the crew, are similar because both of their journeys are focused on their redemptions. It's just the route they took to get there and the why behind their search for it is a bit different is all. Now, you would think that because of how I spoke about him, I am not a fan of James Holden. That isn't the case. I love, absolutely adore, the entire crew of the Rocinante. I do have my favorites. Now, Minagata will never do any wrong in my eyes, even when she's lying about a certain sample that she most certainly did not send flying into the sun, like she had the rest of the crew believe. Yes, I watched episode 6 as well, but I did stop at the start of episode 7. Also, Amos is baby. What can I say? I really, really fucks with Amos Button. But back to what I started this video with. The Expanse is a remarkable show for many reasons, sure. But for me, the reason why I am absolutely in love with it is because it is a show that leans heavily on its characters. Their decisions, their motivations, their arcs, and how their stories span the breadth of the show's own story, merging in a way that is so incredibly satisfying, especially when it stays on the characters' themes. And the themes is very important for the story of The Expanse because it's what makes it so incredibly fulfilling to watch and follow through on. Holden's decision to log the distress call from the scopuli is what tosses him, Naomi, Amos, Alex, and Shed, very briefly, R.I.P. bra, into the maelstrom that is the conspiracy with regards the protomolecule and scientists and capitalist interests who are willing to do anything for the sake of knowledge and to give certain factions more power over the other. His decision, whilst a good one and born from a good place, is what ultimately leads to the death of the rest of the crew on the Canterbury. Miller, on the other hand, has so fallen into disillusionment as a down-on-his-luck, ne'er-do-well cop where he's become part of the system of oppression for the sake of self-preservation, that it took being assigned to Julie's case for him to realize just how much he's failed his fellow belters. And thus, Julie is to Miller what the blowing up of the Canterbury is to Holden. A chance for them to redress wrongs that they have committed, unwittingly in Holden's case, and not so unwittingly for Miller. And before you say so, no, I am not saying that Miller suddenly had a change of heart and became a do-gooder on matters pertaining to the belt. Nor am I saying that he openly states that in the show. Instead, it is something that is inferred if you read between the lines. And even in some of the dialogue when he speaks to Fred Johnson, who is another character I love, by the way, him and his second in command, on matters pertaining to Julie and how the OPA failed her. Because when he basically tells Fred Johnson that Julie sacrificed herself for the OPA, that she took on matters of the belt as an earther more than they've ever done, and she was incredibly brave in that, we see him castigating the OPA that basically uses operatives like Julie to serve their aims and doesn't prioritize their safety as promised when they are trying to get people to sign up for the resistance movement. It is not just a criticism of the OPA, however. It feels like Miller is also castigating himself. He, unlike Julie, is a belter, and yet he took an earther, basically being willing to do anything for and eventually dying for the belt, that had him realize just how much he had failed his people. How, because of his desperation to guarantee his own safety and the disillusionment he felt about the world and the atrocities that have been committed on those in the belt by Earth and Mars, he had just basically given up and allowed himself to become part of the very machine that tried its best to break and contain his people. Julie serves as a mirror to him of how big a failure he's been, and she's the turning point for why he's then so desperate to fix things to redeem himself. Like I said earlier, their relationship is fascinating to me, and I'm definitely itching to make a video on it. But because it's Miller and The Expanse is a show that has a clear understanding of its characters and what makes them tick, his drive and push to be redeemed is quite different from the way in which it is reflected for Holden, even though at both their cores they are searching for and are in need of the same thing. Miller's push for his redemption is colored with his obsession with Julie. She's become his totem, his Hail Mary, his North Star. Through Julie, he's able to analyze his choices and decide if truly what he's doing and the path he's taking is in alignment with what she would want or agree with. Because to him, she wants the good of the Belters more than he ever could. And if he's on this journey to try and make things right, it only makes sense that he turns to the one who in his twisted mind, because I do think that Miller's obsession does imply that he's dealing with some mental health issues, but it makes sense to him to turn to the one person who is the beacon of moral good in his life to help him be in alignment with that. Because ultimately, he wants to be worthy of Julie. He finds himself working towards the goals that she would have pursued, and that is what brings him to his redemption. He tries to earn it, not for himself, but for her. And that is why season 2, episode 5 is such a full circle moment for me. Because he does earn his redemption. He sacrifices himself to save Earth. But he does so with protomolecule Julie being there to talk to her consciousness as she makes that final declaration that he belongs with her. Because that has been the core of what has driven Miller and his decisions since he was first assigned that case and made to look seriously at himself and what he stood for or not stood for most of his life. Like I said, it's beautiful, disturbing, but beautiful. Whilst Holden, on the other hand, like I said at the start, his actions were done from a good place. It isn't his fault that the crew of the Anubis and by extension Jules Pierre Mao and Sedevere Erin White had decided that the Kant was going to be sacrificed to start a war between Mars and Earth, all for the sake of consolidating the power to be gained by virtue of the protomolecule. But even if it was from a good place of wanting to help others and falling into a space where he and the rest of the crew become pawns in a bid to start a war, it doesn't change the fact that James Holden is still saddled with the burden of that, the weight of it, the realization that he basically damned 45 of his fellow crewmates because he heard a young woman crying for help. And when Naomi stops him from the self-destruction that was Holden thinking that it was in any way a good idea to give chase after the Anubis post the destruction of the Canterbury, that self-destruction then solidifies into a desperation to attempt to make things right. And that is what drives his character as the crew starts to unravel the mysteries of the Anubis, the protomolecule it was carrying, the strain of it that Julie picked up and her unwittingly taking it to Eros, the experimentation and open-air laboratory that Jules Pierre Mao and Anthony Dresden then turned Eros into, the all works. Holden wants justice for his dead crewmates and in chasing it uncovers a conspiracy that will pull the entire solar system as they know it into a war. But then that isn't the only driving force behind Holden's desperate search for redemption. When Christian Avasarala, who is yet another character I adore and would die for, When Christian Avasarala visits Holden's home and talks to at least Holden, one of his mothers, specifically the one who carried him as a fetus and gave birth to him, all in a bid for Christian to try and understand Holden and what drives him, Elise reveals to her that Holden was indeed conceived and had been conditioned since he was born to be aware of why he lived and the reason he was born, which is to fight for and protect their land. Elise, who didn't want to see her son saddled with that sort of responsibility, urged him to run and never look back. And that is a core part of who James Holden is and what drives him. He's still trying to find his why. Because we can infer that at his core, he does feel and believed he failed his family and wasn't exactly able to do what he had been born for. Like, sure, his mother did urge him to run and he was following through on her commands, but it doesn't take away the fact that James is someone who is floundering because his very reason for existing, the reason why he was born, is no longer within reach for him. That helplessness, coupled with the guilt of having been responsible for the death of the rest of the crew on the Canterbury, is what drives him to try and make things right. He might not be able to save the farm, but if he can save Earth from a station that had now become some sort of spaceship because of an alien life form that was now hurtling itself at Earth at a speed that would kill billions, then he would do so. He might not be able to go back to a time before the Canterbury was blown up and the rest of the crew on it killed, but he can damn well make sure that those responsible for the destruction of the Cant and the people on it are made to face the justice that their actions demands. And maybe his justice looks remarkably different from Miller's justice that would see Anthony Dresden with a bullet in his head before he can talk his way to freedom and a continuation of his research, but it is justice nonetheless. Both Miller and Holden are willing to die in order to make things right in their pursuit for their own redemption. And like I said, I am still watching the show, so I don't know how things play out for Holden at the end of the last season. Plus, I do have the books as well, so the goal is to read those after I'm all caught up with the show. But if The Expanse does maintain the quality of its storytelling and writing, then I know that the end of Holden's redemption's arc would most likely be as satisfying for me as what I got to experience with Miller. And that is something that delights me, because the conclusion of Miller's redemption arc saw him taking the bomb from Diogo, sending the boy on his way to safety whilst he remained on Eros with his hands on the detonator. In that moment, we see Miller finally come to a point where he is memorialized as a belter who is willing to save the life of a fellow belter, to do something selfless that would then save humanity. A vastly different place from where he was at the start of season 1, where he was looked at, rightfully so, as someone who had betrayed his people. It also saw him willing to give up his life to stay on Eros with protomolecule Julie. We saw him taking off the suit to welcome the infection, but to also let her know that he wasn't going anywhere and was going to stay right there with her consciousness as she steered them to their deaths, preferably to Venus instead of Earth, so there aren't any human losses. He got to die on his own terms, or at least as much as he can die, considering the fact that the protomolecule did infect him, which means that based off of what I understand about how the alien life form operates so far, would most likely have uploaded Miller's consciousness to the central orb like he did with Kenzo in the season 1 finale. But please don't confirm or deny if my thought process in that regard is right or wrong. I would love to be surprised, because I'm 95% sure that the protomolecule is probably still alive somewhere in Venus where Eros crashed. I mean, it isn't really corporeal, so I'm betting it survived in some form. But as I was saying, with Miller and his drive and search and to, in his own way, make up for his past, he was able to do so. It would be interesting if Holden gets to do the same, preferably with Erin Wright and Miles 6 feet under. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm just bloodthirsty like that. Can you all tell why Amos is one of my favorites? But of course, and as always, these are just my thoughts. Would love to hear yours as well. Do you see similarities between Holden and Miller's desperate search for redemption? Would you say that based off of how the episode where he sacrifices himself to be with Julie at the end played out, would you say that Miller's redemption arc was successfully concluded at that point? Please drop your responses in the comments. Like this video if you've watched this far and haven't done so yet. Share it if you want to. Support me on Patreon if you can. And until Monday's video, do remember, obsessing over the things you love, perfectly valid coping mechanism.